Expecting Someone Taller by Tom Holt. Chapter 13. When sufficiently drunk, Logi will tell you the story of the first theft of the ring by himself and Wotan from Alberish. According to him, when he realised that the giants Vassal and Fafnir were determined to exploit his clerical error to the full and claim the goddess Freya as their reward for building the castle of Valhalla, he decided that the only conceivable way out of his difficulties would be to find an alternative reward which the giants would prefer. Finding an alternative to freehold possession of the most definitively beautiful person in the universe, the goddess of beauty herself, was no easy matter, and Logi searched the world in vain for anyone or anything who could think of one, starting with human beings, going on to the lower animals, and finally, in desperation, trying the trees and the rocks. The only creature, animate or inanimate, who could think of anything remotely preferable to Freya was the Nibelung Alberish, and when Logi asked him to explain, Alberish rather foolishly told him about the ring, which first gave him the idea of stealing it. Malcolm had heard this story from Floshild, who did an excellent impression of Logi when drunk, and it was at the back of his mind when he began his world tour. He hoped very much that things had changed since the Dark Ages. Certainly some things were very different now. Freya, for example, had long since fallen in love with a wood elf, with whom she later discovered that she had nothing in common. Centuries of quiet desperation and comfort-eating had taken their toll, and Freya was no longer the most beautiful person in the world. In addition, attitudes have altered significantly since the Dark Ages, with the discovery of such concepts as enlightenment, feminism, and electricity. Malcolm hoped he would quickly find that he was in a minority in regarding love as being the sweetest thing. A quick survey of the thoughts of the human race would, he felt, help put his troubles in perspective. With magical speed he crossed the continents, and the further he went, the more profoundly depressed he became. Admittedly, the concept of love took on some strange forms, especially in California, but by and large the human race was horribly consistent in its belief in its value. No matter how confused, oppressed, famished or embattled they were, the inhabitants of the planet tended to regard it as being the most important thing they could think of, and even the more cynical of mortals preferred it to a visit to the dentist. Not that they were all equally prepared to admit it, but Malcolm was able to read thoughts, and could see what was often hidden from the bearers of those thoughts themselves. Furthermore, with very few exceptions, the human race seemed to find its favourite obsession infuriatingly and inexplicably difficult, and considered it to be the greatest single source of misery in existence. Not that it was an unreasonable view these days. Human beings, as is well known, cannot really be happy unless they are thoroughly miserable, and as a result of Malcolm's work as ring-bearer, there was little else for them to be miserable about. Wherever he went, Malcolm saw ordered prosperity, fertility, and abundance. Just the right amount of rain was falling at just the right time in exactly right places, and at precisely the best moment, armies of combine harvesters, supplied free to the less developed nations by their guiltily prosperous industrial brothers, rolled through wheat fields and paddy fields to scoop up the bounty of the black earth. Even the major armament manufacturers had given up their lawsuits against the United Nations. They'd been suing that worthy institution in the American courts for restraint of trade, arguing that world peace was a conspiracy to send them all out of business, and turned over their entire capacity to the production of agricultural machinery. The whole planet was happily, stupidly content, and in order to rectify the situation, mankind had fallen back on the one source of unhappiness that even the ring could do very little about. Despite this lemming-like rush into love, there was a curious sense of elation and optimism which Malcolm could not at first identify. He was sure that he had come across it somewhere before, many years ago, but he could not isolate it until he happened to pass a school breaking up for the holidays. He remembered the feeling of release and freedom, the knowledge that for the foreseeable future, 3 whole weeks at least, all one's time would be one's own, with no homework to do and no teachers to hate and fear. It was as if the whole world had broken up for an indefinite summer, and everyone was going to Jersey this year, where there are donkeys you can ride along the beach. All this, Malcolm realised, was his doing, the fruit of his own innocuous nature. He remembered that when he was a child, a princess had chosen to get married on a Wednesday, and all the schools in the country had been emancipated for the day. It had been on Wednesdays that his scanty knowledge of mathematics came under severe scrutiny from a bald man with a filthy temper, and he would gladly have given his life for the marvellous lady who had spared him that ordeal for a whole week, allowing him to spend his least favourite day making a model of a jet bomber instead. Malcolm understood that he was now the author of the world's joy, just as the princess had been in his youth. Actually seeing the results of his work made Malcolm feel unsteady, and at first he did not know what to make of it all. The world was happy, safe, and in love, all except a certain M. Fisher who controlled the whole thing, and a small number of supernatural entities who were out to stop him. There seemed to be an indefinable connection between everyone else's happiness and his own misery, and he began to feel distinctly resentful. This resentment was foolish and wrong, but he could not help it. He had never wanted to take away the sins of the world. Once again the old pattern was being fulfilled. Everyone else but him was having a thoroughly good time, and he wasn't allowed to join in. His subjects didn't deserve to be happy. What had they done compared to him to earn this golden age? Before he realised it, he was muttering something to himself about wiping the silly grins off their faces, and the clouds around the globe began to gather. The first drop of rain hit the back of his hand as he sat in Central Park, watching the ludicrously happy New Yorkers gambling by moonlight in what had recently been declared the safest place in the USA. A group of street musicians, dressed in frock coats with their faces painted in black and white squares, were playing the Brandenburg concertos to an appreciative audience of young couples and unarmed policemen, and Malcolm began to feel that enough was enough. He wanted to see these idiots getting rained on, and his wish was granted. As the musicians dived for cover among the trees and rocky outcrops, a tiny Japanese gentleman saw that Malcolm was getting wet and ran across to him with an umbrella. Smiling, he pressed it into Malcolm's hand, said, "Present," and hurried away. Malcolm threw the umbrella from him in disgust. He sat where he was for many hours, the rain running down his face, and tried to think, but he appeared to have lost the knack. For most of the time he was alone, and the only interruptions to his reverie came from the scores of ex-pushers who had moved out of cocaine into bagels when the bottom fell out of drugs. Just before dawn, however, a pigeon floated down out of a tree and sat beside him. "Don't I know you from somewhere?" Malcolm asked the pigeon. "Unlikely," replied his companion. "You were never in these parts before, right?" "Right," Malcolm said. "Sorry." "That's okay. Have a nice day now." The pigeon busied itself with bagel crumbs, and Malcolm rubbed his eyes with his fingertips. "The way I see it," said the pigeon, "you care about people, right? That's good. That's a very positive thing." "But what's the point?" Malcolm said, and reflected as he said it that he was starting to sound like the bloody girl now. "I mean, look at me. I've never been so wretched in my life." "That's bad," said the pigeon sympathetically. "By the way, are you British by any chance?" "Yes," said Malcolm. "They had a British week over at the Bloomingdale's. Scottish shortbread. You get some excellent crumbs off those wings." Already the first joggers were pounding their way across the park, like ghosts caught up in some eternal recurrence of flight and pursuit. Two policemen, who had been discussing the relative merits of their personal diet programs, paused and watched Malcolm as he chatted with the pigeon. "There's a guy over there talking to the birds," said one. "So he's talking to the birds," said the other. "That's cool. I do it all the time." Malcolm looked around slowly. Only he knew how fragile all of this was. The pigeon looked up from its crumbs. "You seem depressed about something," it said. "I've got every right to be bloody depressed," replied Malcolm petulantly. "Everyone's happy except me." "My, we are flaky this morning," said the pigeon. "You should see someone about that before it turns into a complex." "Oh, go away." "You're being very hostile," said the pigeon. "Hostility is a terrible thing. You should try and control it." "Yes, I suppose I should. Do you know who I am?" The pigeon looked at him and then returned to its crumbs. "Everybody is somebody," it said. "Don't feel bad about it." "I thought you birds knew everything," Malcolm said. "You can get out of touch very quickly," said the pigeon. "Have you been on TV or something?" "How come?" asked Malcolm patiently. "I can understand what you're saying." The pigeon acknowledged this. "This makes you something special, I agree. But I'm terribly bad at names." "It doesn't matter, really. I know who you are, said the pigeon suddenly. You're that Malcolm Fisher, aren't you? Pleased to meet you. Can you do something about this rain? Malcolm did something about the rain. It worked. And could you maybe make the evenings a tad longer? Continued the pigeon. This time of year, the people like to come and sit by the lake and eat in the evenings, and that is good for crumbs. So if you put, say, an extra hour and a half on the evenings, there wouldn't be that scramble about 7:30 with all the pigeons coming over from the east. It's getting so you have to be very assertive to get any crumbs at all, and I don't think being assertive suits me. Malcolm promised to look into it. Anything else I can do? He asked. No, said the pigeon. That's fine. Well, be seeing you. It fluttered away, and Malcolm shut his eyes. He felt very tired and very lonely, and even the birds were no help any more. At Combe Hall, a small group had gathered in the drawing room. It was many centuries since they'd met like this, and they were very uncomfortable in each other's company, like estranged relatives who have met at a funeral. Albrecht brought the silence first. He has no right to go off like this, he said. It's downright irresponsible. Why shouldn't he go off if he chooses to? Replied Floshild angrily. He's been under a lot of pressure lately, poor man, and we all know whose fault that is. She looked pointedly at the mother and daughter who were sitting on the sofa. Let's not get emotional here, said Mother Earth. Unfortunately, we're all in his hands, and we can do nothing but wait until he sees fit to return. I wasn't talking to you, said Floshild. I was talking to her. Ortlin said nothing, but simply sat and stared at the floor. Floshild found this profoundly irritating, and finally jumped up and put a cube of sugar down the Valkyrie's neck. Ortlin hardly seemed to notice. That will do, said Mother Earth firmly. Lindsay, perhaps it's best if you went into the library. Oh, no, you don't, said Floshild. I want her here, where I can see what she's doing. This is what comes of involving a civilian, said Albrecht impatiently. Whose idea was it, anyway? It certainly wasn't mine, said Mother Earth. The first I knew about it was when I heard the reports. That's what I don't understand, said Albrecht. Who is this Malcolm Fisher anyway? Anyone less suited to being a ring-bearer? But he's doing wonderfully, said Floshild. Everything is absolutely marvellous, or at least it was until she showed up. I'm not denying that, said Albrecht, but the fact remains that he is not like any other ring-bearer there's ever been. Perhaps that's a good thing, I don't know. But if you girls had your way, he could easily turn out to be the worst ring-bearer in history. Don't look at me, said Floshild. I'm on his side. Who chose him in the first place? That's what I want to know, Albrecht continued. That sort of thing does not just happen. I mean, look at the facts. He accidentally runs over a badger who happens to be Ingolf. It doesn't make sense. I confess to sharing your perplexity, said Mother Earth. This is by no means what I had intended. She stopped, conscious of having disclosed too much. Go on, then, said Albrecht. What was meant to happen? I am not at liberty. Since it didn't happen, said Albrecht, it can't be important. Mother Earth shrugged her brawny shoulders. Very well, then, she said. The ring was supposed to pass the last of the Volsungs. There aren't any more Volsungs, said Floshild. Incorrect. Siegfried and Gudrun did in fact produce a child, a daughter called Sieghild. I never knew that, said Albrecht. Nobody knew. I saw to that. Sieghild was brought up at the court of the King Etzel of Hungary, where she married a man called Unferth, a most unsuitable match, I may say, of which I did not approve. Unfortunately, I was too late to be able to prevent it. And then what happened? I have no idea. Unferth was an itinerant bard by profession, and I lost track of him in his wanderings. By birth he was a Jute, but he never returned to his native Jutland. I can only presume. Floshild ran out of the room. What's she up to now? Muttered Albrecht. Why can't people sit still? Anyway, continued Mother Earth, given the quite remarkable fecundity of the Volsung race, I have little doubt that the family is still extant, and I have spent a great deal of time and effort in trying to trace the survivors of the line. Who could possibly make a better ring-bearer than the descendant of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer? But to date my inquiries have been fruitless. So you think there's a Volsung or two wandering about out there, just waiting for a chance to snap up the ring, said Alberich. That's all we need. On the contrary, said Mother Earth, I still regard the Volsung option as being the best possible solution. The Fisher episode is surely nothing but a strange and unplanned complication which will undoubtedly resolve itself in time. As soon as the missing Volsung is traced and appraised of his destiny, then he can all get back to normal. That's not exactly fair on our young friend Malcolm Fisher, said Alberich. He deserves more consideration than that. I presume that your Volsung would get hold of the ring in the same way that his ancestor Siegfried obtained it from Fafnir. That ought not be necessary, said Mother Earth hurriedly. No, he has had his part to play as a caretaker of the ring, and to date, I must grant you, he has played it very creditably. Only this present difficulty has marred an unexpectedly satisfactory period in the ring's history. Recent events, however, have highlighted the underlying weaknesses in his emotional composition, which makes it obvious he is not to be trusted with the ring on a long-term basis. Unfortunately, as we have recently been made to realize, there is very little that any of us can actually do when the chips are, so to speak, down to influence matters. Thanks to Wotan and of course to my daughter here, all may yet be lost. At this moment, Flosshild came back into the room, carrying a volume of an encyclopedia. Say what you like about old Misery Guts there, she said. She's made a good job of that library. Here we are. She laid the book down on the table. The Jutes, she said, were part of the Anglo-Saxon alliance that colonised Britain after the Romans went home. I seem to remember hearing something about it at the time, said Alberich. Now that you mention it, go on. If your Unferth was a Jew, perhaps he came over to Britain with the rest of them. Have you tried looking here? Mother Earth raised an eyebrow. I must confess that this is a line of inquiry that has not previously occurred to me. These islands have always been so remarkable, heroically and theologically speaking, that I never for one moment imagined that the Volsung line might be found here. It is, of course, possible. Flosshild seemed excited about something. Where would the records be? She asked. This is worth following up. The main archive is at Mimir's Well, replied Mother Earth. I think it would be in order to check this new lead. So what are we waiting for? My dear young woman, said Mother Earth, you don't expect me to abandon this highly delicate situation at this crucial juncture simply to go chasing through the files? I can certainly wait until Mr. Fisher returns from his holiday and this present difficulty has been satisfactorily resolved. Why are you so interested in tracking down this Volsung anyway? Said Alberich suspiciously. I thought you were on Fisher's side. Don't you see, said Flosshild, if we find the person who ought to have the ring, Malcolm won't be able to give it to her, because it won't be his to give away to anyone. He's got wonderful principles. He'll see at once that he has to give it to this Volsung person, and then everything will be all right. Alberich shook his head. You overestimate him, he said. Besides, what guarantee do we have that this Volsung will be any more suitable than Malcolm Fisher? I can reassure you on that point, said Mother Earth. I am, after all, the ancestress of the Volsung race. Admittedly, Wotan is their male ancestor, but that cannot be helped now. You mean this Volsung would be her cousin? Flosshild asked, pointing rather rudely at Ortlind. In strict form, yes. Even so, said Flosshild, it's worth a try. The Volsung race, continued Mother Earth, was specifically designed from the outset to be ring-bearers. They have built into their software all the heroic qualities required to carry out that office in a satisfactory manner. Even after centuries of dilution, the fundamental ingredients ought to still be present. I have no doubts at all in my mind that if a Volsung or Volsungs can be found, our problems will be at an end. But first, it is essential that Mr. Fisher's ridiculous idea of giving the ring to my daughter— Now there I agree with you, said Flosshild. Here, you haven't got anything to say. No, mumbled Ortlind. For a moment Floshild felt very sorry for the Valkyrie. Although she would have liked everything to have been Ortlind's fault, it palpably wasn't, and the girl herself was probably having a rather horrid time. But Floshild hardened her heart. "Why don't you do something useful for a change?" she said. "You nip across to Mimmy as well, and look up the records, if you're so good with libraries." Ortlind shrugged her shoulders and started to get to her feet. "Stay where you are," commanded her mother. "I am not letting you out of my sight until this has been cleared up." Ortlind sat down again. "Well, someone's got to go," said Floshild. "You go then," said Alberich. "You're only getting under our feet here anyway." Floshild made a face at him. Mother Earth raised her hand for order. "I shall telephone the elder Norn," she said. "She is a most competent woman, and I'm sure Mr. Fisher will not begrudge us the cost of a call. To telephone Valhalla from the Taunton area, one has to go through the operator, and the process can take a long time." While Mother Earth was thus engaged, Alberich took Floshild to one side. "You're up to something," he said. "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are. You're going to try and nobble this Volsung, aren't you? You failed to nobble Malcolm Fisher, so you want a chance at someone a bit more vulnerable, or at least with better taste." The Rhine daughter shook her head sadly. "My nobbling days are over," she said. "I've been nobbled myself." "Go on," said Alberich incredulously. "I thought it was all an act." "I wish it was," sighed Floshild, "but it isn't." "But what on earth do you see in him?" "I don't know," said Floshild. "I suppose he's just different. He's sweet. I really have no idea. But I wanted to get him out of all this before they do something horrid to him." Alberich smiled. "This is unusual for you, Floshild," he said. "I always thought you were the hardest of the three. Voglin dries her face with emery paper, and Welgun cleans her teeth with metal polish. But you were always a really tough cookie, and now look at you." "All good things must come to an end," said Floshild. "And I don't suppose he'll ever be interested in me, even if he does get rid of her, which is funny, really," she said bitterly. "After all, he's nothing special, and I am, heaven knows. But there you are." "There you are indeed," said Alberich. "Good luck, anyway." Mother Earth put down the receiver. "Would you believe," she said, "the elder Norn is away on her honeymoon. Apparently she's married a rock troll she met only recently at a company meeting. But the middle Norn has agreed to do the necessary work in the archives, so we can expect results shortly." "Well, that's something anyway," said Floshild, sitting down and putting her feet up. "Now what shall we do?" At that moment the door opened and Malcolm walked in. His hair was wet, although it had not been raining in Somerset. "They told me you were all in here," he said. "If you've got nothing better to do," said the Valkyrie Grimgerd, "you could fix that dripping tap in the kitchen." "I'm busy," Wotan said angrily, but the Valkyrie had gone. He leaned back in his chair and poured himself another large schnapps. Despite the schnapps, he was profoundly worried. It had been a long time since he had heard anything from Somerset, and surely his daughter would have succeeded in her mission by now. She was not, he was fully prepared to admit, an outstandingly intelligent girl, but intelligence was not really required, only beauty and a certain soppiness. Both of these qualities she had in abundance. "Must you sit in here?" asked the Valkyrie Sigrun. "I want to hoover this room."
"Go and hoover somewhere else,"
thundered the god of battles. The Valkyrie swept out without a word, leaving Wotan to his thoughts and his schnapps. He bore the human oil well, he decided. His handling of the world, he was forced to admit, had been largely adequate, but this state of affairs could not be allowed to continue indefinitely, and if Operation Ortlind failed, he could not see what else he could reasonably do.
"If that child messes this up," he growled into his glass, "I'll turn her into a bullfrog."
He closed his eye and tried to get some sleep. When he woke up, he saw that he was surrounded on all sides by daughters. Even allowing for his blurred senses, there seemed to be an awful lot of them. To be precise, 8.
"So you're back at last, are you?" he said. "Well, where is it?"
All the Valkyries were silent, staring sullenly at their shoes, which were identical. When you have 8 daughters, you can save a lot by buying in bulk.
"Where is it?" said Wotan. Come on, give it here.
I haven't got it, Ortlin said softly. He doesn't want me.
You stupid. What do you mean?
He had spilt schnapps all over the covers of the chair, but none of his daughters said a word. This could only mean that Ortlind had failed him, and they were all feeling terribly guilty. He wouldn't give it to me, said Ortlind sadly. He said that he loved me, but he couldn't give it to me. I knew it would happen, sooner or later, so I came home.
But why not? Screamed Wotan. You had the sucker in the palm of your hand, and you let him get away.
I know, said the girl. I have let you down again. I'm sorry.
Get out of my sight, Wotan shouted.
The girl bowed her head and wandered wretchedly away to clean the bathroom. After a short battle with his temper, Wotan managed to control himself and surveyed his 7 other daughters with his one good eye.
Right then, he said briskly. Who's going to be next?
There was a long silence, and nobody moved.
Very well then, Wotan said. Grimgerd, go and do something useful for the first time in your life.
Grimgerd shook her head. There's no point, she said. He knows all about us. He's been talking to Mother, said Wildtrout. He'd recognise me as soon as I walked through the door, Grimgerd continued. It wouldn't work. I'm sorry.
For a moment Wotan was stunned. Then, with a roar like thunder, he leapt to his feet and ran out of the room. All of the lights had gone out all over the house.
We've let him down again, said Grimgerd sadly. If only we could talk to him, said Wildtrout. Where's the point, said Rossweiss. We wouldn't be able to communicate with him.
They went to fetch the Hoover.